Welcome to the Own It Powercast, the place to be when you get serious about making big changes and accelerating growth in your life and in your relationships. Finally create the life you've always wanted, living life on your own terms. Learn how to take your fear and turn it into powerful choices that will create sustained change. Now your host, Mary Baker.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Own It Powercast, a place where you can come to get what you need to move yourself forward. Hey, it's Mary Baker and welcome to episode 134, Why It's Hard to Let Them In, Early Family Boundary Violations. So as you know, this month we're going to be focusing on healthy connection, why we need it, what healthy, vulnerable connection looks like and what it doesn't, and that even though we know it's so important, many of us are not that great at it. And today I want to talk about maybe why. I want to talk about an important aspect of the ability to be vulnerable, and that is all about our first experiences. You've heard me say the first 10 years of your life was your first classroom where you learned to have relationships with yourself and others. The boundary issues that may have happened meant that our sense of self was threatened. Maybe our sense of emotional safety and trust and our ability to have a close, connected adult relationship was strongly influenced. Not to mention, becoming or being healthier parents today can't help but be impacted by how we were raised. Okay, so even though I know we've touched on this in different episodes, I wanted to explore a little more deeply today why you may struggle to be open and vulnerable in your adult relationships and to have really good, healthy connections, not to mention good boundaries. What we're going to talk about is the lack of boundaries, perhaps in your family or whoever took care of you, and the profound effect, the lasting effect of lack of boundaries by parents and caregivers and older siblings can have on our sense of self and how we operate. Here are some different examples. In each category we could talk all day about, but I'll give you an overview. And the first one is more obvious, verbal abuse. Like if you ever suffered any humiliation, any shaming, like what did you do that for? What's wrong with you? Don't you know better? Or why can't you be smart like your sister? Or want to play football like your brother does? Comparison is so humiliating. It immediately tells you you're not good enough and that they are. And what that taps into is our need for parental love and approval and safety. When that feels threatened, everything feels threatened. So emotional abuse is no joke. I think personally that my experience sitting with so many people over the years is it's the emotional abuse that's far more long-lasting and detrimental than the physical abuse. And that's what I want to talk about next. Any physical abuse or sexual abuse, or even the intention, even the threat, even objectifying a child, like a father telling his daughter what she looks like in a certain outfit, making note of parts of their body or how their hair or their face looks, is really objectifying and can be harmful. It's one thing to tell your daughter she's beautiful, especially when you qualify that with inside and out, right? It's another thing to talk about how she looks in that dress. Another way that you could have heard inappropriate messages in terms of your physical boundaries is, and parents probably don't realize that they're doing it, go hug your aunt. She's missed you. She hasn't seen you in a while. Go give grandma a kiss, whether the child wants to or not. And they're not allowed to say no because that would seem unkind and uncaring that you don't love grandma. Or maybe they allowed your sibling into your room to try on your stuff, take your stuff. Or maybe that was done and nothing was done about it, so no justice was served. Or maybe your family didn't teach you that interrupting someone, whether they're trying to get something done, they're in a conversation with someone, they're having some quiet time, There's a lot of subtle and insidious ways that we learned whether to have healthy boundaries in our families or not. And again, we're going to cover the overt and the egregious to the very covert and also egregious, because it all sends the same message. Either we honor each other's boundaries or we don't. Another way you can suffer from lack of boundaries in your family if you grew up with emotional rage. Like if there was a parent or an older sibling or a grandparent that would yell at you and rage when you asked for what you needed or you said no, or you had a different opinion. Maybe you were manipulated, guilted, taught not to have your anger, taught that you're not allowed to have vulnerability or weakness. Men can grow up having learned that very young in their families. Maybe it's not okay to have fear or frustration. And maybe it was awful for anyone to sit in feelings and grieve. Don't have a pity party, right? Get over it. It's not a big deal. All these ways you may have been told how to feel, how to experience something, as opposed to just allowing yourself to experience whatever you're experiencing and have that validated. You know, there's psychological boundary violations too, where you're taught what to think. You're taught what to think about you, about others, about the world, about yourself, about a situation. Wow, and in really unhealthy families, you're taught that nothing happened and that you're crazy. Mom and dad didn't fight. Your brother didn't almost OD. No one screamed at you. No one shamed you. No one stole your stuff out of your room. That is so crazy making. We should never be taught what to think, how to think, what to believe about ourselves, what to believe about what just went down. You can be told what you need and what you don't, what you should need and what you shouldn't. You don't need any more clothes. You have a whole closet full. You don't need that food. You're just going to put on more weight. You've had enough. As opposed to, I understand you want more cookies, honey, but I think that's enough for now. So, all kinds of boundary blurs where someone got in your space, whether it's your physical space or your heart space or your head space, or probably all three, because families that don't have boundaries don't have boundaries. They don't have boundaries anywhere. Now, some families are more egregious than others in terms they're violating, of course. But they all blurred your sense of who you are. And some of them are so subtle because maybe you figured, yeah, my family was loving. They really cared for me. We cared for each other. We hugged. We talked. Wasn't that vulnerability? Not necessarily. And that is why it's really important to look at some of the more subtle stuff that you may not have noticed immediately, but that can have impacts on your self-esteem, your own sense of boundaries, and your grown-up relationships. All right, so why does all this stuff happen? Well, the obvious answer first is your parents didn't have great boundaries when they were growing up. And I can tell you, from sitting with so many people, it seems like every generation tries to do better than the one before. In other words, your parents and their parents probably had a harder time than how they've treated you. Usually because they grew up and they didn't want to be like that. They didn't want you to have the childhood that they had. In fact, you'll find, I think that, and we'll get into this in a minute, that a lot of parents that grew up with cold parenting, where they weren't really loved or nurtured, might have been too enmeshed with you. They swung the pendulum in the other direction. We can all be guilty of that at times, to overcompensate, because they wanted you to have a different childhood. But when we swing the pendulum in the other direction, that's not always so terribly healthy either. So what was happening is your parents were getting needs met, emotional and psychological needs, by child affection, meaning your approval, your affection, your unconditional love, because you weren't going anywhere. you were pretty much a captive audience up until the age of 10 or 11. And you believed what they said was gospel. You had to. You didn't know any better. We're supposed to be able to trust our parents. However, if you wanted to have healthy separateness, and this is usually why adolescence can seem like it brings about all these problems, that the parent has an issue, okay? Because this is going to threaten the enmeshment that they want. They may act out in shame and rage and guilt you to meet their needs. They'll do whatever it takes, because when you start pulling away and start becoming a separate person, and that starts in the preteen years, that can feel threatening, as opposed to the healthy, them wanting you to be strong and independent and on your own and to have your own life. They needed you to be there to meet their needs. So this is where you see a lot of conflict and a lot of adolescent acting out to differentiate, to have some power, to get out from underneath of the control, because enmeshment is control. You may not have felt it on the face of it, but it is control. So to survive, you either had to act out and pull away or disown what you thought and need and felt. Even if you acted out and pulled away, you still walked away with the message that you shouldn't trust what you feel and what you need. Or at the very least, you should feel shitty and guilty about it. So then the parents' own unmet needs. It's sad when you step back and think about it. They tried to get met from their child as opposed to doing their own therapeutic work, healing what happened when they grew up, and getting those needs met in healthy adult relationships, aka their spouse, their siblings, their friends, and in therapy. So what happens later as you become a grown-up? One of the most obvious ones is it hammers your self-esteem. How could it not? We just talked about being shamed and guilted, manipulated, taught what to think and feel and need as opposed to what you really do. It tanked your self-trust and your self-love, and it can really hurt your self-confidence. The other thing it does that a lot of people don't realize is that it causes a form of PTSD, like a low-level, day in, day out trauma response, because you didn't know what to expect. Okay, so you may have mood issues. You may become disproportionately upset and angry about something, and you may not know why. You may be very defensive, reactionary, fear-based, impulsive. The list goes on. A lot of fear stuff, a lot of self-protective stuff. Because it wasn't stable when you were growing up. Even someone who grew up with a parent who wasn't a nasty drunk, but what if she came home from school all the time and she never knew if mom was going to be passed out on the couch, or if dinner was going to be ready, or if mom was upright and functional, or dad went to work. See, not knowing what to expect, the eggshells on the floor, is everything. That's what builds our sense of trust or not. That's what creates that ongoing anxiety or not. Another thing it causes is emotional incest or covert incest. It's an awful sounding term because it is awful. And that's when your parent or your caregiver relied on you for support, like we talked about a moment ago, that an adult partner would usually provide, okay? Like emotional support or financial support, physical support. They shouldn't be emptying your piggy bank to pay their bills. That happens, you know. But covert incest is a little different than what we think of as physical incest because it doesn't really involve sexual abuse. Now, it can involve sexual suggestion. I'm not going to get into that part today, but it doesn't have to. See, because it's just about parents feeling alone and unloved. And so, like we just talked about, rather than them going to adults to get that need met appropriately, they turn to the child to care about them and for emotional connection. They don't have any coping skills. And so if you were the kid, You weren't going to develop coping skills either, and you modeled their maladaptive coping skills, their defense mechanisms, as ways to operate in life. So if you're wondering where you got them, there you are. You also couldn't feel safe. How could you? If your parent can't cope, how the hell can you feel safe? You don't respect them. You don't look up to them, even though you wanted to so badly. Kids are affected by emotional incest because later in life, they're a lot more likely to have addiction and substance abuse issues, compulsive behavior, poor boundaries in their relationships. The other thing we haven't talked about yet is when there are blurred boundaries, people take responsibility for other people too, like other people's happiness, other people's choices, other people's view of them, aka people pleasing. This is where all this stuff is learned. You didn't learn detachment, how to let go, how to let other people sit in their own stuff, how to let yourself sit in your own stuff and not want to be rescued and bailed out and enabled. Growing up with blurred boundaries causes huge trust issues on so many levels. Think about it. If you couldn't trust people to respect your boundaries in your own family of origin, who can you trust? And then, like we've talked about before, you probably went on to put other people in your life that you couldn't trust either, because they let you down because that's all they knew. Like hangs out with like. So then this was just reinforced. And when you have trust issues, it's hard to become close to people because you have this fear of intimacy, because your idea of intimacy is not fun. It could have been scary for some of you. Intimacy could have equaled, oh great, so I lose my boundaries and my sense of self in order to be with you. That's a heavy statement, but I want you to think about that for a moment. What are your templates of being close to someone? Because if they're not great, they could have left you overwhelmed and feeling overly responsible in a relationship. You learn not to trust yourself. That's another big issue. Learn to doubt your own needs, your feelings, your wants, your thoughts, your beliefs. Creates that internal fight, that anxiety we talk all about on the show. In essence, it's because it's not safe to be vulnerable and it's not safe to be authentic. You know, a lot of people then have a hard time sustaining intimate relationships. They may start out really strong and have a great honeymoon, but then they go downhill pretty quickly because real intimacy starts, and that can be terrifying. So rather than allow it to happen, you can come up with reasons not to trust your partner or feel insecure or trapped. There might be a lot of push-pull going on, like I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. Some sabotaging, maybe acting out when people get too close. Especially if people get too close and kind of tell you the truth about you, that's a perfect time to run. I'm being facetious. Another thing that I don't think we talk about enough in relationships is triangulation. Sidestepping, going directly to the person that you need to deal with and going to someone else that knows them and or is close to them. So let's talk about them. Let me tell you about how I'm upset about what they did or what she did, because deep down I don't have the courage to address her directly. Because maybe I'm really afraid of conflict. I'm afraid of what might happen, and I just don't feel strong enough to do that. Remember, we've talked about the moment on this podcast and how those moments growing up, if they weren't fabulous, if you were raged at or shamed or ignored or whatever, it's going to be really hard for you to want to confront. If the only template of conflict in your home was really unhealthy or not at all, how are you going to know, or how are you going to want to confront someone? But you have to get it out, right? You got to talk about what you need, what you're pissed about, and what you feel. So you talk about them instead of talking to them. Nothing ever really gets resolved. In fact, It creates a lot of drama in family relationships. You know that. Creates a lot of drama in romantic relationships. And it makes it unsafe for everybody. Because if you're triangulating with them, you're triangulating with her too. No one is safe and no one is exempt. Everyone thinks, oh, they won't do that to me. Really? That's the only way they know how to operate. You think if they're coming to you, talking to you about her, that they're not telling her about you, you're crazy. What I mean by that is, that's the only way they know. So what's not learned is healthy boundaries, about reality, about cause and effect, how to have trust in relationships. Trust requires honesty, healthy separateness, healthy boundaries where you end and others begin, so you can feel safe in your own skin. And there are rules of engagement in that relationship so you can feel safe in that relationship with them. So let's do some examples real quick just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you a couple of vignettes and I want you to label the issues for yourself, along with trying to see if maybe you experienced anything similar or maybe your partner did, just to give you some more understanding. All right. So the first one is Sarah, and Sarah was about 5 years old when she began to notice that her mother would share things with her that she didn't quite understand. It would make her a little anxious, but she listened. I mean, what else was she going to do? At first, she felt a little bit scared because she wasn't too sure about what her mom was talking about. Her mom would go on and on about how her mom couldn't get her dad to be reliable, to pay the bills, to be romantic when she wanted him to be, or to make enough money. It would make Sarah worry. It would make Sarah feel some kind of way about her dad, too. Do you see how it impacted her relationship with her dad? But eventually it made Sarah feel kind of special, too. Because, see, this way she had a bond with her mom that her father didn't. And she was privy to some really private info, not to mention the ability to be mom's confidant and make mom smile and make her laugh. It gave Sarah a false sense of empowerment in a very unhealthy way. But it wasn't until years and years later that Sarah realized how unhealthy that was. All right, so what do you think was going on there? A lot of things, but the ones that stood out for me were enmeshment, definitely covert incest there. Mom should never have put the stuff about her marriage onto Sarah. That was Sarah's father. That didn't allow Sarah to have her own experience of her father as a child, which probably wasn't great knowing he married her mom, but still, it warped that for her, and that wasn't fair. There was no healthy separateness for Sarah. She wasn't allowed just to be a 5-year-old kid or a 6-year-old kid or a 10-year-old kid. Now she felt this inordinate responsibility that she never should have had. Therefore, she became parentified. And she learned not to confront reality, not to face conflict, that when you have a marriage, you never talk about stuff directly, you don't solve problems, you don't set boundaries, you don't deal with it. So a lot of impacts for Sarah. And she didn't get to be a little kid, like innocent, and have her mom be a grown-up and her dad be a grown-up and have them take care of her. What about what she needed? She needed to feel safe, and here she's worried about the mortgage being paid at 5. I mean, that just sets off a whole nother session of anxiety for this child, inability to trust. We're supposed to be able to have basic trust in our parents, in our teachers, in our coaches, in our neighbors when we're little kids, because we're small and we're fragile and we're powerless. The next example is Ronnie. And, Ronnie told me how he couldn't wait to get on the bus for school when he was little or go to his grandparents in the summer because he never knew when his dad would lose his shit, sometimes even over the smallest things, like maybe when there were dishes left in the sink or his sister didn't behave at the dinner table. Then his parents would often fight, and at times it became kind of scary, especially when his parents were drinking. Oftentimes there was a lot of yelling, cursing, shaming comments, defensiveness, Sometimes things being thrown and broken. He never really witnessed his dad hitting his mom, but he was often hiding in his closet, scared of the loud noises and what might happen. His biggest fear is that they would divorce, and then he didn't know if his family would be okay. Later, the family would act like nothing even happened. It was never talked about. When his sister spoke up at times, his mom would just say, "Don't say anything to your dad because you're really just going to set him off. He was just having a bad day anyway. It's no big deal." Wow. So here, I'm sure you picked out the rage. The dad would rage to get needs met, to be taken care of, quote unquote, by the family. A lot of emotional abuse, the shaming, the threatening, the yelling, the cursing. Ronnie felt physically unsafe because he would hear things breaking and dad being destructive. No sense of safety or trust there. Definitely some PTSD for Ronnie as he was always on alert, never knowing what people were going to do. Crazy making happening, right? Mom was responsible for that. She's like, "It's no big deal. Nothing happened. What's wrong with you? You shouldn't feel scared," in essence, Mom was saying. You shouldn't feel upset, you shouldn't feel pissed, and you shouldn't feel scared. So Ronnie and his sister learned to avoid conflict and to never confront someone or set a boundary with them. And Mom never did anything either, and that's a big deal. Dad made them feel unsafe by acting out instead of protecting his home and his little ones, and Mom allowed it. She co-signed it. So then the kid learns, well, what grown-ups can I trust? Okay, so those are two examples of growing up with blurred boundaries. There's a million other examples out there. I just want you to create some awareness for yourself and to kind of think about the impacts of any that you experienced growing up. So today we explored, again, because I think it's an important topic, some of the reasons why it may have been difficult for you to be vulnerable as a kid, and probably how it may still be hard for you today. We covered boundary blurs, emotional abuse, and covert incest. We then discussed why parents can do this without realizing it and certainly not meaning to, but that the impacts can be huge on our self-esteem and our adult relationships. Thank you so much for joining me today. May you stay healthy, stay in your own skin, and trust yourself this week. Focus on the good that you can find this week in yourself and others. If you don't get the newsletter, go grab one at ownitpowercast.com. It comes out every Tuesday. I don't throw a bunch of stuff into your inbox other than that. And if you do get it, pass it along to others who may benefit from it. All right, so pay it forward, keep focusing on you, and I'll see you next time.
We hope you took away some useful insights and tools you can begin using right away. If you did, please leave a positive review and share on your social media. Because could you imagine if everyone in your life really got it together? Remember, own it now, so you can really own it later.